Hello and welcome. Today we're in conversation with Dr. Rakshanda Jalil. She is a writer, a translator, a scholar, and a critic. She has written Invisible Cities, The Hidden Monuments of Delhi, and a book of short stories called Release and Other Stories. Her PhD thesis, published by the Oxford University Press with the title Liking Progress, Loving Change, was about Urdu writers in the Progressive Writers Alliance in the early 20th century. Welcome, Dr. Jalil. Today we will talk about her latest book, Jallianwala Bagh, Literary Responses in Prose and Poetry. As the title suggests, the book is a collection of writings about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, written originally in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, and English. Dr. Jalil herself has translated the Urdu. Before we delve into the book, I'd like to ask you about the current politics surrounding the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Theresa May said in the UK Parliament that the government expresses deep regret, yet stopped short of issuing a formal apology. The opposition in England wants a formal apology from the government. Yet the UK Foreign Minister has said that there might be financial implications of making an apology, which is why they cannot do so. What are your thoughts about that?
I think Theresa May's words are too little too late. I think saying that she deeply regrets the action are variations on the theme that we have already heard over the years. Each time a president or a member of the royal family has visited Amritsar, they have expressed regret. Now, I think this is way beyond regret. It is a phenomenal tragedy. It is an act of unprecedented bestiality. If you would permit, I'm going to read Tagore's response that comes on 30th May 1919, and he's saying, considering that such treatment has been meted out to a population disarmed and resourceless by a power which has most terribly efficient organization for destruction of human lives, we must strongly assert that it can claim no political expediency, for far less moral justification. So I think Tagore's words 100 years later still ring true. Nobody is asking for financial reimbursement because, as you might know, a great many people who themselves lost their lives or who lost family members, their extended family refused to accept the money being handed out as compensation by the Punjab government way back then in 1919. So I think the question of financial recompense doesn't really arise. I mean, I don't see much talk about it, and I don't think there's any currency in that. However, the question of moral ownership, you know, my friend, the philosopher Ramu Gandhi, who used to teach at Delhi University, who'd written many books, used to say this in the context of the partition. He would say that somebody has to stand up and apologize. Somebody, a leader or somebody with moral authority, from both sides of the border, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, has to stand up and just say, I am deeply sorry. And he used to say that in the context of the partition. I would say that this applies just as much to Jallianwala Bagh. All that people seem to want to find closure to it is for somebody to say not just that they are regretful for it. You might recall that there is a certain person who did say in the context of the Gujarat riots who was then heading the state, who said that it was unfortunate. And he used a rather unfortunate simile of a puppy being mowed down by a car on a road. We're not talking about those things. We are talking about a full and final closure. And I think a full and final closure requires a full and final apology, not mealy mouthed words.
Very well said. So I would like to just challenge your response a little bit, because I've heard that, I mean, Shashi Tharoor, for instance, does talk about reparations. There are other thinkers who mention that there should be reparations for colonial crimes. And so do you think that something like this incident fits the ambit of what would count for reparations?
See, reparations are of a variety of misdeeds, from pilfering and taking away national treasures. So we've been talking about the Elgin marbles, we've been talking about the Kohinoor, we have been talking about various things. But to my mind, Jallianwala Bagh is not an object that can be returned. Jallianwala Bagh is a tragedy that can only be acknowledged. So reparation in the case of Jallianwala Bagh does not require you can't even actually, you're a student of philosophy, perhaps Karan, you will appreciate it. We are not even asking for our dignity to be returned to us. So we are not talking about tangibles like the Elgin marbles or the Kohinoor. We are certainly talking about intangibles. We are just saying, accept as a state, not as individuals. Nobody is asking Theresa May to acknowledge in her personal capacity, but the state, but the government, the nation state has to somewhere down the line, even 100 years later. And remember, 100 years is not very long in the history of nations, in the history of civilizations. We are not going back in time and talking about the Battle of Plassey. We are not going back in time and talking about the Mughals. We are not talking about Mahmud Ghazni, who is said to have plundered temples. We are not going back into hundreds and hundreds of years. We are going back into something as recent as 100 years. There is no question of financial recompense. There is no question of returning an object, a thing of immense value. We are simply asking for, in a purely metaphysical sense, in a purely philosophical sense, a sense of ownership for a terrible crime that might give some sense of closure to the many, many people affected by it. And I don't think that is too much to ask for, and I'm at a loss to understand why it is so mingy and it is so sort of tardy in coming.
I mean, it is after all the same government 100 years ago that is still sort of in power. I mean, the country hasn't changed, it hasn't gone through any serious change of government. So
and Karan, let's not forget that a purse was collected, a kitty was collected, and a substantial amount of money was raised to be given to General Dyer. Michael O'Dwyer, of course, was, as we know, shot by Udham Singh, but Dyer died a natural death of ill health. But in the years that he lived after Jallianwala Bagh, in certain quarters in UK, amongst his own people, he was a hero. And that is very, very difficult to stomach.
That is indeed very troubling. I mean, so this offers us a natural segue into talking about General Dyer, who forms an important component of this book. I mean, there are 2 or 3 pieces that are about his character, what was going on in his mind before the massacre took place, what happened after, I mean, the judgment that took place, and whether he was really, I mean, aware of what he was doing, to what degree he was a racist, to what degree did he...
How he himself viewed his actions.
How he himself viewed his actions, because there is evidence that he sought kind of to win over the Sikhs afterwards, right?
Yeah. There's also talk of him giving, and I've mentioned that in my introduction, just one day before, when he was patrolling the streets of Amritsar, he gave a speech in Urdu. He knew Urdu. He was born in India. His parents were sort of the upholders of the white man's burden in that sense. He'd spent a substantial amount of time. He'd worked with Sikhs and Punjabis in particular. He was familiar with the Punjab. He was posted in Jalandhar, from where he was called to take command of Amritsar. So he claimed to know the Sikhs, and he had many, many Sikhs under him. We have a very interesting section, again a fictional recreation in Chaman Nahal's novel. I've used an extract here in this book about his thoughts, what was going on in his mind, the kind of instructions he was giving to his men, and how hands-on he was as a commander. He would go and issue instructions. He was actually, so this whole business of it being a spontaneous firing actually flies in the face of the backstory we have. What was Dyer doing just a day prior to it? The extent of preparedness that was there. And what I like about fiction, and what I think books like this do, are give backstories to people. So General Dyer is somebody that you and I encountered in our school textbooks, and he's a flat character. He's a monster. He's a character that he's a kind of a caricature of a bestial person. But he's a flesh and blood human being. There are thoughts going on in his head. There is an impulse behind his actions. So we need to understand what kind of person is he. I mean, even a monster has thoughts, so we need to know what those monstrous thoughts are. And I think what fiction does is it helps, is fleshes out people. So there is Chaman Nahal's novel, and I've used this entire chapter there. There is Stanley Wolpert's extract again in this book. Stanley Wolpert wrote a fictionalized recreation of this. So the extract that has been chosen here in this book is about the court-martial, the questions that are being asked in the Hunter Commission. So when Hunter is asking him questions, the kind of answers that Dyer is giving, they hold out a clue to what his motivations were. So he comes across as a very introverted, closed person, not given to enlarging upon his arguments. In his own mind, he's very clear of his compulsions in ordering the firing. Then there is the poetry. We must also briefly talk about that. I have only been able to take a handful of poetry from Punjabi, one from Urdu, one from Hindi, one from English, and several from Urdu. Now, in the vast amounts of Urdu poetry that I read, from which I made this selection, you know, Dyer and Dyer, and I think there's some confusion in the minds of a lot of poets. They seem to use it loosely. I think they are not very certain that these are two different people, though of course some seem to be certain that this is Michael O'Dwyer and General Edward Dyer. But Dyer and O'Dwyer are almost being used as metaphors for cruelty. So there is the poetry that I've chosen here. There's vast amounts of other poetry that I was not able to use for reasons of space, where Dyer and O'Dwyer keep cropping up. And they're being flung into a larger sort of narrative of cruelty, of oppression, of being fed up with the British rule, of the British being, their presence in India being morally untenable. And this is an idea that comes out repeatedly, that they have to go, they have to go. It's another matter that they go as late as 47, and this is happening in 1919. But from 1919 onwards, in the poetry, in the bhashas, we see this kind of, you know, this anger, this being this sense of disquiet that is bordering on being fed up of the British presence.
So since we're talking about poetry, and since we're talking about Dyer and O'Dwyer, I'd like you to maybe read a little bit from the book, from the poem If You Wish to Learn
Yeah,
Mercy.
I'd love to read something from a man called Ahmaq Papundwi. Obviously, it's a nom de plume. This is not his real name. And the poem is called If You Wish to Learn Mercy. Now, this I think is very illuminating of the ways in which people learn to deal with the situation post Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh has happened. The British are there to stay. There's a substantial section of Indians who are still, despite incidents such as Jallianwala Bagh, despite the widespread protests against Rowlatt Act, are still, as it were, sucking up, to use a modern word, to the British. And so it's important to see how is another section of the Indian population responding to this. And I found this response very interesting. So here's Ahmaq Papundwi, and this translation is mine from Urdu. If you wish to learn mercy, learn it from Dyer, and learn the principles of justice from O'Dwyer. And how best to flatter the masters, learn the technique from the Khan Bahadur. And how to earn your daily bread honestly, learn it from any officer in the secret police. Now, in much of Urdu literature, not just poetry but fiction as well, the Khufiya police, the secret police, is an object of much ridicule, mockery, dread, hatred, fear. But all through colonial literature, he is a constant figure. All the stories about all the dogs and rats, learn them from any reader in any school. The procedure and policy of joint butchering, if you still don't know how, learn it from your friend's dagger. Why drown of shame in the tank of a mosque when you can learn it from the wily Kitchener? Everything that we know as glorious and nationalistic, learn it from Mustafa Kemal and from Anwar. Now, it's interesting that by the time the First World War ends, Turkey, as you know, has entered the fray pretty early on in the First World War. The Indians and the Indian Muslims in particular are very in a dilemma. How do they respond to Turkey being there? They are fighting under the British flag, and there is Turkey, and here they are opposing the Khalifa. Then with the rise of Mustafa Kemal, with the disbanding of the Ottoman Empire, with Mustafa Kemal emerging as a hero, there is a substantial section of Indian Muslims, and we'll come to the Khilafat movement, which comes out shortly after Jallianwala Bagh, we have a substantial section of Indian Muslims who are holding up Anwar Masood and Mustafa Kamal Pasha as symbols of the kind of heroes that are possible in these times. And so Ahmed Papundvi is in a sense reflecting this popular sentiment in favor of Mustafa Kamal Pasha.
So since you were talking about history and literature, and you by profession are a literary historian.
I wish I had a profession. I'm just a literary historian by training.
By training. So could you say what it means, basically what it means to be a literary historian?
Yeah. So I trained as a literary historian when very late in life I was doing a PhD on a literary grouping known as the progressive writers movement. So a literary historian is somebody who looks at that intersection of literature and history and looks at the literature that comes out from that intersection. So for someone like me, while a text is important, I mean, I'm a student of literature, so of course a text has primary importance, but I'm equally interested in the context, and over the years the context has become very interesting for me. For example, if I'm looking at a text written in 1936, I also want to look at what else was happening in the world of literature, not just in my own area of work, which is Urdu, but let's say Hindi or Punjabi or other literatures. So I want to join the dots and I want to look at what is happening. Now, going back to my own work, from which actually this comes out, I have in the past looked at the literature that came out from the partition, poetry in particular. I've looked at the literature that came out from the First War of Independence, which is 1857. And shortly before this book, I was working at the literature that came out from the First World War. And this is the book that came out from it. It's called The Great War, Indian Writings from the First World War. Now, 1914 to 1918, the First World War rages, and there is a huge Indian participation in this war, which is not always acknowledged. But my sense was that given the numbers, we know that 13 lakh people from the Indian subcontinent participated in this war, of whom 74,000 died. Now, this is a huge number. Given these numbers, it seemed to me that surely it would have found some representation in the languages most affected by it, which is Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Bangla, and English. So I set about looking for material. There was some that we already knew existed. For instance, there's this sweet, tender, romantic story called Usne Kaha Tha by a man called Chandradhar Sharma Guleri. 2 major Hindi films have been based on it, but it has traditionally been seen as, it's acknowledged as the first Hindi short story. It was published in 1914 in Hindi in a journal called Saraswati, and it is taken to be the first Hindi short story. But to my mind, it has this other significance, which is it gives a first very real account of life in the trenches. So it's about men from the Punjab who are fighting the Goras war in the trenches in Flanders and in France. And the conditions in those trenches, how cold it is, how wet it is, how it affects morale. And then, of course, there is the other text, which is the love story. So I was very interested in looking at other such examples of literature from Urdu, from Bangla, from Punjabi, and I was able to find a substantial amount of literature. So this came out in the book called The Great War, published by Bloomsbury last year. But coming very naturally from that is this collection of writings on Jallianwala Bagh. Remember that the First World War ends on 11th November 1918, and just a few months later Jallianwala Bagh happens, and there is ample reason for the disquiet in Punjab. Punjab is on the boil. The returning soldiers are coming back with stories, they're coming back with an exposure to the world. The Ghadarites, the Ghadar movement has been very strong and active in the Punjab. The Ghadarites are coming back. So Punjab is pretty much on the boil, as it were, when Jallianwala Bagh happens. And after Jallianwala Bagh happens, there is an enormous sense of anger that, look, we gave you our sons, we gave you our men, and this is what you give us. What were we doing? We were only peacefully protesting against Montagu reforms, against Rowlatt Act, right? And we are just asking for the reforms that were promised to us in the course of the war. Right. When Gandhi is pitching in and saying, yes, the Rowlatt Act is a draconian piece of legislation and we must have peaceful protests. Everywhere the emphasis is on peaceful protests. And yet Michael Dyer and General Dyer are convinced that this unrest, which is indeed happening, which is indeed a fact around all around them in Amritsar and in the hinterland, in the rural areas, they misinterpret that unrest as a kind of a second Ghadar waiting to happen, as a second 1857 to waiting to happen. And it is in their misreading of that situation that Jallianwala Bagh happens.
Right. I did want to ask you, how large of a part do you think, since we're talking about the First World War, how large of a part does it form in kind of creating this unrest that is taking part in the Punjab? Because these soldiers are returning from foreign countries, they're aware of the nationalisms that are taking place all across the world, and they must feel that it's quite hypocritical of the British to enforce such draconian legislation in Punjab while at the same time they're fighting their war in other places.
You know, we have accounts from letters. The letters themselves have been destroyed, but thanks to the censor office, another very clever piece of systematic keeping an eye from the colonial enterprise. So the censor office has already translated and kept aside these letters that the Indian soldiers are writing to family back home. And that, by the way, I would urge people to read it. It's available in a public online archive which you can access from the British Library. Anybody sitting anywhere in any part of the world can find it online. And those letters are luminous. They are talking about human beings being cannon fodder, which we are able to corroborate from military sources. So the casualties are very, very high in Flanders and in parts of France, precisely because the Indian army is a kind of a bulwark. It is out there to face the first line of firing, right? So all of these experiences are trickling back. Then let's not forget the Ghadarites who are present in large numbers in Germany, in large parts of Europe. They are coming up with very ingenious ways of dispersing information. So the Ghadarites are joining forces with the Germans, and we have instances of low-flying aircraft plastering trenches and fields where Indian soldiers are with what is considered subversive literature in Punjabi, in Urdu and Hindi, which raises issues of all kinds. Of course, it's telling them that shame on you, here you are fighting the Gora's war. So some are outright, kind of shaming them. And the others are raising very vital issues. They're talking about equal work and equal pay. They're talking about how poorly the Indian soldiers are paid compared to their counterparts. By the way, their counterparts from other parts of the Commonwealth. Let us not forget, there are white soldiers from the Commonwealth, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Newfoundland, from South Africa. Let us also not forget that in the years ahead, and that is a cause for concern for people like me, that when I went around looking for the Indian presence, and I'm digressing here a little, but allow me to say this, that when I went looking for accounts of Indian presence, I found large numbers of accounts from the Commonwealth, of the white soldiers from Australia, from South Africa. When you talk of Gallipoli, I mean, there are films that valorize Gallipoli and the Australians and the New Zealanders and the others, but there's no presence of the Indians. So the dark-skinned Indian soldiers are kind of marginalized. Films that have been made, you see the occasional dark-skinned turban soldier, but he is pretty much on the fringes of the frame. So that was cause for concern. Now to come back to what I was trying to talk about, the Ghadarites. So there is a kind of attempt of the Ghadarites to join forces with the Germans and sensitize the Indian soldiers that, look, you are being used here. Look how poorly you face compared to the white soldiers from the rest of the Commonwealth. Look at your salaries and look at the money that is given to them. These are enlisted men. Some have volunteered, others have been co-opted. So So it's talking about bad living conditions, it's talking about how ill-equipped they are for the weather, and all of these these are true things, you know. We are able to corroborate this from the letters that these soldiers too are writing. There's poor food that is not adequate, food that the Indian soldiers are not used to, you know. So all of these are major issues. As the war is dragging on and coming to an end, by the time 1918 comes around, the soldiers who are returning have seen the world. This has been their first big exposure to the rest of the world. There are soldiers who have gone to West Asia, Middle East, to as far east as Singapore, as Hong Kong, and of course Europe. This is the first big encounter. It's going to be much later that Indians in large numbers begin to go to get an education, but that is going to happen later, and that will be the educated middle class. Here, the bulk of people who have gone are either semi-literate or completely illiterate. They are soldiers who worked in the fields, who have not really had much exposure even with the whites in their own country. Right? So when they go, for example, and this is where literature helps us. We have very luminous accounts in Mulk Raj Anand's novel of the Indian soldiers' first interactions with the Maims, with the Goras, with the French women. And for instance, and this is what literature does. It kind of leavens things. It opens windows. So it gives another layer to understanding historical events which are often left out by the professional historian. So there is Mulk Raj Anand talking about an encounter between a peasant from the Punjab and how he's taken in by how kind the French women are. They are offering them fruit and flowers and saying that, you know, you've come to save our country, and how different they are from the Maims, the Gora Maims back home. Now, coming back to your question about how this kind of segues to the Jallianwala Bagh, there is a substantial section of people in Punjab, in Amritsar, in the hinterland, in Lahore, in large parts of Punjab who have either directly experienced the war, or who have at least one, if not more, member of the family who has been to the war and has come back with stories about the war, who has written about the war. So there is and Punjab more so than other parts of the country. There is the Northwest Frontier Province that has sent soldiers. There are the Gurkhas, there are the people from UP, from Bengal, from the different presidencies. But Punjab has sent the largest number of people. So there is virtually no family in the Punjab which is not affected by the war, right? There's no family in the Punjab that does not have a story about the big encounter with the world outside Punjab. And I think it is this. Bedari is an Urdu word which means a kind of an awareness. So there is a wave of awareness, and the poets and the political leaders, whether it is Kichlu, whether it is Gandhi, all of them are tapping into that wave of awareness. That wave is there. Michael O'Dwyer and General Dyer misinterpret it as a wave that is going to lead to an uprising. We don't know. It's hard to say that if Jallianwala Bagh had not happened, would this wave have culminated into an 1857? That is hard to tell.
This is especially interesting since you're talking about the use of literature in understanding these historical events. I mean, the sense that literature gives a kind of wider angle with which to look at things, a better understanding of the personal lives of the people implicated in these historical events that are otherwise very flat to us, right? But there is also some risk in taking literature as an authoritative source of history, right?
I'm not for a minute, Karan, suggesting that this is the authoritative account of the First Wall and this is the authoritative account of Jallianwala Bagh. No, I'm just saying it adds another layer of meaning. Let me give you an example. In the Jallianwala Bagh, there is a plaque to Ratan Devi, a woman who lost her husband in the firing. And she defied curfew and other things, and she sat in the Bagh all night with the dead body of her husband in her lap and holding a stick in the other hand to keep the dogs and the jackals and the hyenas at bay, which are all around because there is there are dead and dying people, wounded people, there is blood on the ground. So it is only to be expected that wild animals and dogs, stray dogs would come. This is a grisly sight. Right. We know that Ratan Devi is a real person because there is a plaque to her. Right. But we don't have a backstory, and that is what fiction does. Ratan Devi figures time and time again in this book. In a play by Bhisham Sani, another major Hindi writer, who's written a play called Rang De Basanti. In Act 3, Scene 4, which I have used here in translation, we have Ratan Devi as a major character. She's a flesh and blood person. There is a Baisakhi ka Mela. She has gone for the Mela. She has bought herself a parandi. Her friends have bought new dupattas. Some have brought bangles. So life is normal, the very normalcy of life, the buoyancy of life in Punjab. Politically aware, yes. Political energy coursing through the streets of Amritsar, yes. But nevertheless, not in Amritsar on the brink of a revolution. Not in Amritsar on the brink of a mutiny. But yes, an Amritsar which is buoyant, which is in a sense as yet untouched by tragedy. So that life with Ratan Devi, Ratto as she is called by her friends and neighbors, is brought alive. So Bhisham Sani's play gives us the backstory of Ratan Devi, and Ratan Devi figures several times. There's a poem about her in Punjabi, there are references to Ratan Devi. So I think the Ratan Devi who is confined to a plaque in a museum comes alive through literature, and that is what literature does. So not for a minute am I saying make this an authoritative telling of a historical event, but please allow yourselves the luxury of literature opening and unraveling, unpacking a larger tragedy and sort of showing you other components of that tragedy.
Right. And so two things come to my mind when you say that. One, that since you mentioned in the introduction yourself that there is a kind of remarkable fidelity of detail in the stories themselves, that they corroborate details with each other and with other historical accounts. So you realize that the writers writing at the time, they're very aware of what went on and kind of committed to representing it as accurately as they saw it or witnessed it as they could.
Or through oral testimonies.
Or through oral testimonies. And the other thing that comes to my mind is the Stanley Wolpert account, because, I mean, just as much as literature can serve to give us a better interpretation of history or better sense of the real lives of historical characters, it can also serve as a useful tool, it seems, to give a narrative to certain, I mean, that we know are historical events, but when we render them in the form of a story or a poem or something, I mean, that works, right? I mean, just as in that account.
Sure. There is a document called the Hunter Commission report. Now, this is a real document. It was 2 volumes were published at that time, and the British government felt that the entire report should not be published at that time, because obviously it was far too sensitive, it contained very volatile information. But later by historians such as Professor V.N. Datta, who have done enormous work on Jallianwala Bagh. So this generation of historians published those unpublished reports. Now the Hunter Commission is a vital piece of information. It is a meticulous document with who said what. What Stanley Wolpert does is he relies on that document, he uses it and he transforms it into a fictional account which does not stray very far from the historical account. So someone like Stanley Wolpert, given his own background, given his own grounding in history and in literature and his past experience of writing on historical events, what he does, and to an extent what Chaman Nahal also does, a professor of English in Delhi University, they do rely on historical accounts. So it's not as though they completely move away from history and go into the realm of kind of a mythic reimagination. But I also want to draw your attention to something else that I've included here, which is in the nature of what shall I say, magic realism is possibly the only word, a term that was made popular by Salman Rushdie much later. In the 80s, we have Midnight's Children. Remember, that also has an account of Jallianwala Bagh, because if you recall, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children also mentions the protagonist's father being present there and how he sneezed and a whole lot of things happened. So the extract I've chosen here from Abdullah Hussein's seminal novel Udas Naslein, written in Urdu in 1963, translated by Abdullah Hussein himself as The Weary Generations, has an entire chapter. Now, we do know about the Motilal Nehru Commission, which was the Congress which went into a fact-finding commission. We know about the Hunter Commission, which was appointed by the British government to come to India and to meet people, and it had an Indian presence as well. But there were many citizens' inquiry committees. And Abdullah Hussain in his novel talks about a fictionalized citizens committee, a group of concerned citizens go and talk to people there. And here there is a completely fictionalized encounter between an imaginary fish seller and Naeem, who was a member of the Citizens Committee, and this is where magic realism comes in. And your earlier question about how far and how close fiction is to literature is answered by this encounter, that this is a completely imaginary encounter between a fish seller who claims that a fish flew out of my bucket and hit in English agora, and he fired. I mean, we have no, this has not been corroborated by other sources, but sometimes even something like this, fantastic though it sounds, magically realistic though it is, what does it do? It allows an entry into an incident which is enormous in its kind of barbaricness. So sometimes, again to use a modern expression, to wrap your head around something that is so huge, that is so monstrous, you sometimes need an entry which only magic realism allows. So again, I'm not saying that this fisherman was a real character, that the fish flew out of his bucket, but I'm just saying that this sometimes is what fiction does. It allows an entry, and then once you enter, you find your way, you navigate your way, and you pick the facts from the fables.
So since we're talking about barbaric kind of events and barbaric rulings and acts, I mean, one thing that is strikingly mentioned in the book is the crawling order,
yes.
right? And although the story that is about the crawling order is not magical, the Ringnewala is not magical realism, there is an element of such great humor in it that I think it's worth speaking about.
Okay, let me first briefly talk about the crawling order. The martial law is in place, and well before the martial law, in fact, there is a lane called Gali Kurchian in Amritsar, where a day before the Jallianwala Bagh incident, a British missionary woman, Miss Sherwood, who is cycling around, is attacked by a mob that has been enraged by firing in the town hall. This mob attacks, assaults, beats up Miss Sherwood. At the same time, people in that gully take her in, give her shelter, tend to her wounds, and ensure that she's sent away to the safety of the fort where the rest of the British population has taken refuge. But Dyer is so enraged by this attack on a British woman, which he sees, I think there are two things here. He sees an attack on a woman as an assault on the honor of the British race. And I think he's also reminded of 1857, when women and children were attacked in the residency in Lucknow. And so there are all kinds of things going around in his head. We can only imagine, but clearly he is most affected by this attack on Miss Sherwood, and he wants to teach the people of Amritsar a lesson. So he has a crawling order. It's called the crawling order. I mean, there's no order as in this is martial law, so a general can do what he pleases. So he has the ends of that gully, and it's a fairly long gully, cordoned off, and there are thrashing posts fixed on either end of the gully. A thrashing post is a triangular contraption, again devised by Dyer, and what kind of mind comes up with these things. So you have a triangular thrashing post where a man who has disobeyed any of General Dyer's rules, and the form of disobedience could be flouting curfew rules, failing to do a salam to a British officer, getting off his cycle or his horse when he sees an Englishman approaching. All of these are General Dyer's orders. So anybody who flouts these orders is then strapped to that. It's a bit like your tripod actually. It's a triangular piece which like a tripod, and people are tied to this and lashed, right? So there are thrashing posts on either end of the curfew, of the lane, and the crawling order is that anybody who wishes to go into the lane, anybody who lives there, needs to come out of his house or needs to go back into it, has to crawl not just on all fours but on his belly, like a snake or a reptile. So you have to cross on your belly, and that takes some doing, believe me, to do that, to cross the length of the gully. Now, obviously, people don't want to do that, so they stay indoors. They are hungry, they are ill, they can't go out for food, for medicines, to bury their dead. So if a death has taken place, they can't bury their dead, they can't come out of their homes. Now, in Ghulam Abbas' story, which I've included here, called Rengne Wale, those who crawled, one man comes with news of an illness in the village, and he has to perforce crawl. It's a sight to make anybody cry. Two young men show up from somewhere, and they are nicely dressed, they are athletic, they are energetic, they take off their clothes and they begin to crawl. And they crawl not once but twice and thrice. And as it turns out, they have made a bet with each other. Let's see who wins. Now, what is Ghulam Abbas saying through this story? He's saying that how do you subvert, how do you turn something around on its head, something so beastly, something so draconian, something so monstrous? How do you engage with this? The only way to do it is to subvert it. And the way to do it is to say that, okay, I'm going to mock your order, I'm going to flout your order, but I shall do it mockingly. And the story ends with the white officer in control of the thrashing posts and the lane, just sort of getting apoplectic with rage and telling these young men to go away. And he knows that he has actually been mocked and reviled in this instance.
Yeah. The story ends with the scene of the Gurkha soldier
laughing.
Yeah.
So even the Gurkhas, who so far have been very sort of, sphinx-like in the face of the action, end up laughing because this is ridicule at its finest.
Right. Great. Okay. Thank you so much for the very illuminating and interesting conversation.
Very good talking to you. Thank you.
You too.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.